All right. Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. This is Will Moyer from the University of Michigan. I'm one of the principal investigators of the NINDS R25 Clinical Trials Methodology course. Our website is neurotrials.training. It is my pleasure to be introducing Dr. Marler, who is our final presenter for our 2014 series of webinars. This will be archived on our website. At the end of this, so that we can make sure that everything is uh, well evaluated and that we make this course even better for our next year, I will put up a little link for our evaluations. I'll put this in the chat window up there as well. This will be a partly interactive session. I will be asking some questions of Dr. Marler as we go along. If you could look up at the upper right next to my face, there is a chat window. You may type questions there. Dr. Marler is an employee of the FDA, so that if there are questions that are very specific, he may not be able to. He probably won't be able to comment on specific cases, and we will certainly try to get back to you with answers if we can in real time. If not, we may have to try to refer you to someone to answer those questions, but we will do our best to try to hear what you have to say. So the sort of target for this webinar is the idea that in many clinical trials, the investigator may be the sponsor, may be having to write an IND. We're also interested in the potential for having to write an IDE, although this is less common and outside of Dr. Marler's sphere of influence. Just by way of introduction, many of you are familiar with Dr. Marler. He has helped shape the direction for national funding for clinical neuroscience research, as he was the Associate Director for Clinical Trials in the National Institutes of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke at the NIH. He also worked as the project officer for the seminal NINDS-TPA stroke trial. Right now, he is a medical officer in the Division of Neurology Products at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. It is with great pleasure that I hand it over to Dr. Marler.
Well, thanks, Will. I was glad to receive the invitation. It's always good to imagine that you have some useful function in the process of getting clinical trials going. I have to give a disclaimer that the views you hear today are from me and aren't those of the FDA. True to my motto that I learned even when I was at NINDS, that the FDA never says anything, they always write everything, and I think you'll see some evidence of that here. So the fact that I'm employed by the FDA and speaking doesn't mean that the FDA is saying anything. I do work for the Center for Drugs, and the entirely different set of rules governs devices, and I wanted to make clear that although there are very close analogies, I'm told, I'm not going to be talking about investigational device exemptions, or IDEs. My real purpose here is that I see evidence on a weekly basis that, in particular, there are some problems that academic investigators have when they submit an IND application. And I realize from a lot of experience that these delays in the startup of a trial are extremely frustrating. So I want you to know that FDA, at least, is on board with trying to run as many of these processes that you have in the startup phase in parallel, the IRB, the whatever your granting institution is requiring, whatever your department is requiring. We try to stay as much as we can out of the way. But I did want to share some ideas that I have that might make it easier for you to spend less time writing the application, as well as less time between when you submit the application and when you actually have an IND that's in effect, so that you can go on and do the the research that you want to do. I again caution you that anything I say that seems to go against the rules and laws and regulations that govern FDA is purely an accident. This being the FDA, a couple of people have looked at my slides. They didn't see anything, but you can't take us to court on what these slides say. Well, I, about 5 years ago, made the transition from NINDS to FDA. And one of my first realizations was that it's almost all about safety at FDA. And as an academic, I've been much more concerned about the efficacy side of things and the scientific design, making sure that the blinding was really top-notch, that there was no dropout, that all the analyses were thoroughly planned before the first patient was randomized. So I was very much focused on what I call the efficacy aspect. I mean, when you apply for a grant, your reviewers aren't usually saying, is this person going to be able to keep the patient safe? They're saying, is the scientific basis sound, and will the question be able to be answered? So that when you sit down to write your IND application, it's important to kind of change your shift and realize that really what the purpose of the IND is about safety, and I'll get a little more into that, perhaps more than you want. But the main concepts today, besides safety, will be that actually many studies don't have to be performed under an IND regulations, and that an IND usually includes only a single trial at the beginning, but you can amend the same application. You don't have to send in a new application for an IND when you go to phase 2 or later studies. You do need to send in the protocol, but you don't need to go through the entire IND process. And somewhere in the last couple of slides, I'll be reminding you that an IND being in effect under your name does imply some important responsibilities. And it is one of the places that you can get into some pretty difficult problems if you don't pay attention. I also discovered at the FDA that there aren't just neurologists doing neurological clinical trials. In fact, that the neurological expertise, when it actually comes to developing a drug is really not where all the work and smarts are. Definitely the center of who's the FDA from your perspective as an IND applicant is the regulatory project manager. These people are usually PharmDs or PhDs who actually have a lot of knowledge relating to all the different disciplines that will review your IND. I would encourage you to, and we'll be repeatedly encouraging you through this lecture, to learn to know your regulatory project manager. This is the face for you at FDA. The clinical reviewers for the neurology division are largely MDs. Many of them have had academic positions before they came to FDA, and many have come from clinical practice to work here. Each year I have growing respect for the PhD pharmacologists and toxicologists that look at the animal data that is submitted to actually make the first use of justify the first use of a drug in humans. In other words, to look at the non-clinical safety. The clinical pharmacologists are a mix of PhDs and MDs who are looking at the pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, and drug interactions in humans. I never really had a lot of interest in that until I got to FDA, when I realized how this non-clinical data, the clinical pharmacology, can really be important stumbling blocks in developing a drug, and it gave me a little more sympathy for all of the requirements that are placed largely on manufacturers, not on academics, for developing this data. And then we've got a whole building full of PhD statisticians who review the trials and go over the data and the design of the larger trials. Usually they do not participate in the review of IND applications. And then there's this group called Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Quality Control, who are largely PhD chemists. And making a drug and ensuring its quality is a lot harder than you might think. Many of the drugs that never make it to market have good clinical data to support their potential utility, but it turns out to be very hard to manufacture the drug and keep it on the shelf and active for a year.
I had a question on that. Is a placebo a drug in that space?
If you're giving it to the patient in a clinical trial, it is something that you have to be very careful to describe what you're doing as the placebo. I'll mention that in passing, but it's a very good question, and we do have our CMC folks look at the placebo. There are interesting situations. One of the CMC chemists brought up the fact that the placebo for a study using a drug intrathecally, they didn't have specific instructions about the type. They were using an IV drug, and for that you can use bacteriostatic water. I may not have the correct technical term, but he said there weren't instructions in the IND applications to ensure that it was mixed with a water that didn't have a bacteriostatic component. Apparently there's an alcohol, benzyl alcohol perhaps, in bacteriostatic water that had recently been described as potentially injurious to the spinal cord if it was injected intrathecally. So they play a vital role, and it's hardly a month goes by that they don't teach me something that I hadn't known that really does have clinical significance. So yes, just saying you're using a placebo, if the reviewers is on their toes, they will usually ask you to describe that exactly. You can get into some problems that you can accidentally, for instance, another thing is you can actually, lose the potency of your test drug if you're re-encapsulating it to disguise it compared to the placebo. And this varies widely. Some drugs it doesn't make any difference. In other drugs, you can have an effect that you wouldn't, if you weren't a chemist, you wouldn't expect. So, now who is Your FDA? I wanted to get back a little bit to say that although they were a large regulatory organization and the communication is very formal, there is a person, a face that who's a central communicator between all of these different people who will look at an IND application. When we usually have a meeting before we decide on each IND, and many of these meetings have 10 people at them with 5 to 6 different specialties. We call them disciplines, looking at these different aspects of any IND. The project manager is your way of getting your message back and forth to the people who are reviewing your application, and who will send you questions after you submit it that we hope can prevent you from being put on hold or your application being returned without being in effect. So you don't want to become a nuisance, but you will find that if they say they will notify you on a certain date, that they're usually early and not often late, and that you can count on your project manager. They're actually your fans when it comes to getting through all of the paperwork here. So if after you get your letter with an IND, put that person's phone number in your list of contacts, because if anything comes up that you have a quick response. You don't want to be wasting time looking for who to call. I want you to realize when you're writing your IND, I think a lot of the trouble that and we do see academic investigators have a little bit of trouble getting their INDs approved. And I think I said before, it's this shift of thinking from efficacy to safety. You just have to realize that safety is really what we're looking at. Are you going to hurt people accidentally, inadvertently, with the study that we want you to do? If you're doing a larger study, a phase 2 trial, then the second purpose of the IND process here is we want to be sure of the scientific quality of what you're doing, because if we approve a study or don't make comments on a study and it goes forward and someone later submits it to get approval to sell the drug, and then we say, well, there was this problem, then we look bad that we hadn't mentioned it earlier. So you will find that for larger trials and trials designed to evaluate efficacy, that is part of the purpose of the IND process. However, most people come in with smaller safety and dose tolerability studies, so it isn't a common problem. As I said before, many studies really don't require an IND, and this is an axle you can get wrapped around for a long time. So I'm trying to propose to you a way to make it as simple as possible. Naturally, you'd like to be exempt because there are a lot of regulations and requirements if there's an IND in effect for your particular study. And you want to determine if you have an exempt drug development plan going on. There are criteria listed. You can find them in the regulations. I'll be showing them to you in just a minute here. You are actually allowed to decide yourself whether your study is exempt or not. If you do, you don't have to send in an application and you're done. If you're not exempt or you don't know, then what I'm going to suggest is that you send us a request about whether you're exempt or not, that could be sure and include enough information, and I think you can do this with minimal effort, enough information that if you are not exempt, and sometimes there are some surprises here, then that we can go ahead and put an IND into effect. This saves you the difficulty of us calling you and saying you can't do your study, and you have to stop it until you get an IND if you're not exempt, and allows us to not become viewed as an obstacle to your progress, which we certainly don't want to be. So what I'm going to say is, if you're really confident you're exempt, you can send us a letter, describe your study, and I'll be telling you what to mention in the letter, and we'll agree with you, and you can proceed without IND being in effect. But otherwise, I suggest that if there's doubt or a question, that you send us enough information that it will can adequately be reviewed as an IND application. Here are the exemptions from, go ahead.
Well, I think one other thing is that oftentimes I, as an investigator at an academic institution, I may try to make that decision, but in reality, I'm not going to make that decision. My institution's IRB is going to make that decision. And I think in the academic space, frequently it is drugs that are approved for other indications, but the expansion to a new population and the, I guess, risk-benefit profile in that space, I think frequently it's difficult for the IRB, that is by definition a generalist body, to sort of understand that and know which way to go with it. And they do often defer and request us to send information to the FDA for them to help with that exemption determination.
Yes, and I think what I'm encouraging you to do is more initially to prevent even more later. So I'm 100% on board with what you just said, that that I can say that you're empowered to do that, but other people can disagree. And we acknowledge that, as you'll see in future slides. And I'm trying to tell you how to do that with the least annoyance to you, get the result they want and you want, and make us be less of an obstacle and more of a facilitator here. I put in italics the most important requirement for exemption. The first says that your study results won't be used to support a new label or change of label. Now, you may not have that intention in your mind, but if you're getting money from a pharmaceutical company and they're collecting the data and you're giving the data to them, my guess is that they may want you to get an IND, and for their own reasons, they may not want to put you on their IND. And there are a lot of different situations there. So usually you can say that isn't the purpose of it, to change a label, but just be aware that again, some people are surprised when we say, well, that's not as clear to us as it is to you. The study results won't support changes in advertising of a marketed drug. That's usually pretty easy to agree to. Requirements for IRB approval are met. As you just mentioned, here's one of those maddening circles that we get into. We're saying you have to have IRB approval, and they're saying you have to have an IND. The study complies with requirements concerning the promotion and sale of investigational drugs. No problem. Not intended to invoke exemption from informed consent. So that's one that's kind of sneaked in there. It isn't on all the lists that you might see, but that's something more recent that's developed as exception from informed consent has come into place. And actually, for the same study, you may end up needing 2 INDs. Or a study that normally wouldn't need an IND will need an IND if you introduce exception from informed consent, because the perception of risk and safety changes for the population that is being included in those trials.
Dr. Marler,
yes.
I think this question here from Carson Ryder is interesting. I'm going to take a stab at it, even though you're the presenter, because I can tell him how the sequence would work at the University of Michigan. And I would say that if I needed to do an IND, my IRB would actually put a hold on my application. They may, if there's things they obviously see, they would send it back to me and say, address these things. But if there was an IND pending, they would not give me full approval, and they would that process may go in parallel, it may go in sequence. If they know that I'm sending it to the into the FDA, they may wait to get the letter from the FDA until they issue full approval. And then if you're registering on clinicaltrials.gov, at least at our IRB, having the clinicaltrials.gov number on the consent form is a requirement. So if I'm going to submit it to my IRB, I do need to know what my NCT number is before I can do that. Knowing that if you have a protocol that's in play and under review, you may need to amend your sort of record in clinicaltrials.gov. But again, there's other ways to approach that. You could put that the number's pending on your informed consent form, but your IRB will return that to you as a contingency and say, okay, you're ready to go. Put in your clinicaltrials.gov number. That's pretty.
What we observe is a wide variation in what is required of the investigator. As far as I know, the philosophy here in the neurology division is the only approval we're focused on is the approval. It isn't even technically an approval, the issuing the IND. We don't require you to send us an approved consent form. It's nice because often that's where we find the best description of what you're actually studying. But we just try to get you an answer within 30 days of when you submit your application, and leave it up to you to be able to run processes in parallel or not. I myself, for the whole process, I think that it would be nice if the institutions and the IRBs and the monitoring committees and the funding institutions did as much as possible to allow you to run all these different approvals in parallel. But of course, sometimes they eventually have to get into step. So the second point on the slide that's showing now is that we do understand that IRBs and research sponsors ask investigators to obtain a written opinion from the FDA about whether or not an IND is required. And to avoid unnecessary delays, at least here in our division, we encourage you to submit a letter with some readily available attachments. In our mind, and I'm sure that there are probably some exceptions, we don't imagine that there are a lot of people applying for an IND who don't have the protocol and a ghost of a consent form already filled out. And so I'm going to outline, if you want to write a letter to say that we get FDA to agree that your project really is exempt, we ask you to send us a cover letter that gives a study overview, including a plan for safety monitoring. And I added that because we get a lot of cover letters that describe to us at great length the mechanism of the disease and how it's going to work and all the benefits it's going to have, but it doesn't say how you're going to keep from hurting patients. And that's what we really want to hear. We want to know the name of the drug. We want to know the dosage forms, whether you're going to make any modifications to the approved formulations. That means grinding it up and putting it in a capsule, for instance. We want to know if you're going to dissolve it in a different solution. We want to know the dose, the frequency and duration of the dose for the study drug. And this is largely so we can look at the label and make sure that your use is consistent with what is approved use for the drug or not. And if it's not, I'll be telling you about the additional information that you may need to supply. But at that point, you're not exempt because you may be exempt, but generally are not exempt, and your request for an exemption at that point can turn into an application. If it doesn't, it costs time and can create difficulties. So we, in addition to a cover letter, which you might think is all you need to get an exemption, we suggest that you attach a protocol for the study and a copy of the package insert for the drug that you're going to use. And I suggest that you don't get this offline, but you actually get it from the pharmacist who's going to be giving the drug to your patients, because we don't have a perfect world. What's online may not match what's packed with the drug that your pharmacist distributes. We also ask that you fill out Forms 1571, 72, and 3674. The first ones are old FDA forms that everyone's used to. 3674 is simply an agreement that you're going to put it in clinicaltrials.gov. And then finally add your CV, because we're supposed to evaluate the competence of the person performing the trial. I wanted to list some problems. I've been keeping notes of kind of what's common problems with getting exemptions. Essentially, it boils down to we don't have enough information. The description of the study leaves out important information. The protocol doesn't exclude patients with contraindications listed on the label. We view that as pretty important. The protocol doesn't require recommended safety monitoring described in the drug label. The drug isn't really an approved drug with a label and prescribing information. For instance, and there are other examples, but one that snags a lot of people is that a dietary supplement, even though you can buy it at a grocery store and it seems to have some FDA-liking stuff on it, technically is not an approved drug. And you're pushing the boundaries of exemption right there. So because you're using a food supplement, presumably intending to treat a disease. And so at this point, you're going to need to have some conversations with a review project manager, or request a meeting, or work out some details on how you can get moving on this project. There are two separate laws that apply to dietary supplements. I'm not a technical expert on it, but it can get more complicated than you would expect. We all know that some vitamins at some doses can be quite toxic. That's just an example of why these ambiguities exist. And if you're using an investigational device to administer your drug, there can be some additional difficulties that are introduced that lead to you needing an IND. And I just went 2 slides, I think. So I want to leave exemption and now start talking about the fact that for either because of the dose, because it's a drug that you're getting from an investigational drug that hasn't been approved yet, you're using a different route of administration, you're using it in patients that the drug hasn't been approved for, then you do need an IND application for your, in order to get an IND in effect so that you're exempt from the regulations that govern approved drugs. And this application I copied from information, this outline of the application content I copied from some entries on a website. I actually was surprised at how good it was. It's improved since I first got here 5 years ago, and I'll be giving you that at the end of the presentation. I'm going to talk about some of the items on this list that form the content of an IND application that seem to give the most trouble. The cover letter generally just has to say who you are. It's usually addressed to the division director of the division that you're interested in, neurology products. You don't need a name. I'll show you the address at the end. Like NIH, all of the applications go to one address, they do a really good job. I haven't heard of one getting lost yet in 5 years, so I think things go very well. The cover sheet is a Form 1571. The table of contents may seem extraneous, but it reassures us that you've addressed each of the items. The introductory statement and investigational plan causes a lot of people problems, so I'll be going over that in perhaps a lot of detail, maybe too much detail. The investigator's brochure, we hear a lot of jokes about what's an investigator's brochure. It's not a description of the resort where the investigator site is. It's a description of what an investigator needs to know to participate in the trial. The protocol, I don't have slides in the future on that, but it is amazing to us how many IND applications from academic investigators come in without a protocol. To me, personally, it's the fundamental scientific instrument that's being used here, and it's really asking us to really stretch our imaginations to think that this is a good scientific project if there isn't readily available enough that you couldn't just staple it to the application, a protocol. But it is called for specifically for a complete IND, and we bend over backwards to accept whatever you send us. More on that later. Chemistry, manufacturing, and control information, you can just say none for an approved drug, or if you don't have any. Similarly, for the animal data, the non-clinical pharmacology and toxicology information. Previous human experience gives a lot of problems. I'll be addressing that later, because it's one of the easiest ways to justify a larger dose and different route of administration, some of the things that are common for approved drugs. And then another thing is copies of references and additional information. We have good electronic resources here, but a lot of the references you cite are, and read, presumably, don't pull up readily, and we have very limited time to look at this, so we often end up requesting copies of the full references, so it will save you time and us time if those are included. Particularly the older references are harder for us to get. So more about safety and thinking about it. If you, I break safety into 3 components that you should address or should be addressed in the IND application. First of all, we take for granted that when you take a pill, it's made to be consistent and then you can count on having what the label says it does, but there's a lot of work that goes into that drug manufacturers deal with, but I as an academic and maybe you as an academic don't really get that involved with, but it's one thing that we consider in an IND application. Is what you're giving the patient well manufactured, safe, and of high quality? The other thing is that, and this is primarily for drugs that have not been given to humans before, but whether you can believe it or not, there have been citizens of the United States in past years who died taking drugs that had not been tested in animals, which is a source of the requirement that there be animal data justifying the safety for all drugs that are before they're introduced to humans. Drug companies take care of that when they get a drug approved. There are situations, and I've been involved with them when I was at NIH, where an academic investigation had to stop and go back and thoroughly test in and do the animal studies before they could move forward to test in humans. And then there's human safety, and more on that. Drug quality, as I said, if it's an FDA-approved drug, you can usually assume that the drug meets quality standards, and the way you justify that is simply to attach a copy of the drug label, as I mentioned before, to your application. If it's an investigational drug, it's not approved. Usually you're getting this from a drug manufacturer, and they have an IND, and they will give you a letter that says we can look at the data in their application. Interestingly enough, they usually don't give you permission to see what's in that application, and that I've learned to understand that there's very good reason for that. We certainly then don't release to you what information is in their IND either. That association with the manufacturer can also save you the trouble of writing an investigator brochure, because often they will loan you that as well to use in your study. I put this on my list because it's actually occurred to me a couple of times that there are academics who want to make their own drug. Sometimes they see it as buying it off the shelf, a USP product, and putting it in capsules. That's one thing. There are people who actually try to manufacture it. That's well beyond the scope of this talk, and you're taking on a project there that can take months, if not years, to complete, because after you make it and show that it is the drug quality, as you'll see on a future slide, you then have to go and test it in animals to prove safety. And I'm not going to go into any depth on dietary supplements other than to warn you that it's probably a good idea to read the different regulations. You can read about it online. There's some controversies going on there and discussions about exactly what is required. All we really want to do is make sure the patient is safe and see that there are appropriate studies to back up that safety. But tread with caution when you're talking about using something that doesn't have an FDA-approved label for a particular indication and an approved dose on it. Non-clinical safety, this is animal testing. Off-the-shelf FDA-approved drug, the drug label takes care of that. you can put a blank sheet behind that item or a blank space on the outline. Investigational drug supplied by another sponsor. The only way I know how to deal with this is to get the letter of reference for them to fill in this animal aspect of the safety. Investigational drug you made yourself, I just discussed that. And the dietary supplement, I was involved in, I believe, 2 trials when I was at NIH, where actually NIH agreed to go out and fund the animal testing of a dietary supplement at the high doses that were being used in trials to demonstrate that they were safe. It was not cheap, and it was not a short time. It delayed the progress moving forward by months. It's not necessary for all dietary supplements, but it's the kind of problem I wanted to give you some insight you could run into. Non-clinical safety. If you're using an approved drug or an investigational drug at a higher dose than that tested in existing pharmacological and toxicological data, then you may need to perform these non-clinical studies. This takes time and usually significant resources. Another example, if you're using drugs in combination with standard treatment, you may be asked for evidence that there's not a drug interaction. Clinical pharmacologists are pretty savvy on this, as well as the non-clinical folks, and you certainly don't want to give a drug, a neuroprotectant, that completely neutralizes the effect of TPA accidentally. And so, for example, you may be asked if you get for a neuroprotectant drug to do some, actually they turn out to be relatively simple and can take a week or two rather than years to do some non-clinical testing. This is actually in vitro testing, could be done to show that TPA doesn't lose its activity in the presence of the test drug that you're using. Clinical safety. The path to demonstrating clinical safety of the drug dose at a higher dose is often that you can find published studies with case reports and series to support the safety of a higher dose. You don't always need this, but it certainly simplifies the process for you because if that safety information is in the published literature, you don't then need the non-clinical safety data. So that the clinical safety data, if it's available and we find it's convincing and there are no concerns that the higher dose needs further testing in animals, you can get past the non-clinical safety requirement if there's adequate human experience that's incredible sources that you can cite. I'll go into a little bit more on that in the next slide. An investigational drug supplied by another sponsor, if their animal testing and clinical testing supports use of the way you want to do it, that makes it a lot simpler. Again, make a drug yourself and you'll discover why it's hard to be a pharmaceutical company. Clinical safety. For a higher dose, different route of administration, dietary supplement, or other use not described on an approved label, you may include, as evidence of clinical safety, a summary of previous human experience with the use you propose, described in the medical literature at doses as high as you propose for your investigation. For instance, if you're giving the drug intrathecally, there is a prescribed list of animal testing studies that you need to do. However, if you can find where in clinical use people have published descriptions of how it's been done and done safely at the dose you're using, then you may not need to do the animal testing. I'm not promising that you won't, but I'm just saying you may not, depending on how convincing that data is. And it's a lot more convincing to us if it's described in a paragraph and analyzed in a paragraph, but it's helpful to put it in a table with numbered rows for each reference. Hopefully there's more than one supporting your use. and with columns showing the dose, the duration of treatment, the number of patients treated, the disease the patients had, the number of adverse events and outcomes, so on, with a citation, and actually including a copy of the reference is also helpful. The introductory statement, it's surprising how many applications we get where we really cannot tell the maximum dose of the drug you propose to use and the route of administration. You've got to get that in there somewhere for us, or we can't really move forward. The formulation means all the other ingredients. Again, if you give us the drug label, that information is usually there. These sections are taken right from the regulations. It tells you exactly what information we need. For some reason, we often don't see a lot of it, and sometimes we have to cause problems that we don't want to cause by asking or insisting that it be there. If the dose, all of a sudden this being a webinar is dawning on me. Is anyone out there? We're moving along okay? Give me a nod, Will.
Yes, I think we're moving along okay.
Okay.
We've got about 14 minutes left in our scheduled time. So, you know, again, to leave a little time for some interaction, you know, we can always answer questions by email later. This has been great so far.
Here are my suggestions for describing the overall drug. We want to know what you're going to do for the year that the first year your IND is in effect. And we need a rationale for the drug and the dose. If you're going to be using a higher dose, it really helps us if you can tell us why. We're willing to look at a little risk to the patients if there's a really good reason to do it. But sometimes it isn't actually as clear to us as it is to you what that reason for going for the higher dose is. A lot of INDs that we get from manufacturers, they do the phase 1, phase 2 trials in a couple of months. So we, in that case, would like to know not the design of the trials, because you can submit that after you get the initial IND, but we'd like to know the general direction they're headed so we know what to expect. The maximum dose is really important for everyone who applies. A lot of dose escalation studies. It's important to describe the lower doses, but really what we want to know is what the ceiling is. What's the maximum dose you're going to give the patients? Because we regard that as we don't like to see these escalations where they just keep going and going and going. There's no end. Because we need to know that it's been properly tested at all the different doses. I talked about the investigator's brochure. Essentially, it's telling physicians what they need to do. For a one-site study in which the investigator is the one seeing the patient, really the drug label in many cases is a really good substitute for this, if the drug is an approved drug. But if you're going to a multi-center trial, it may be a good idea to go on, explain the rationale, add material to the drug label. It can be part of the brochure, but go on and explain particular circumstances that they might encounter because of the higher dose you're using or because of the different indication and how to respond to that, so you get uniformity across multiple sites. There is some flexibility there for smaller studies and single center studies. But what we really need to see, put it in italics here, is the pharmacological and toxicological effects in animals that you can describe supporting the non-clinical safety of the drug. And that belongs in the investigator's brochure so that the physicians treating it can understand what led to some of the warnings and precautions that you're introducing in your protocol. I'm going to skip this and get right to one of the other problems that we see is, as I mentioned, grant applications are often designed to convince reviewers that of the scientific validity and the great effect that you're going to produce that make this trial worth spending some money on. We're not that interested in that. We take your judgment that it's a worthwhile project pretty much at face value. What we need you to do is to show it's safe, and in almost the same detail that you want to show to your grant reviewers that it's scientifically valid. So it does require a little bit of work, but all of that work is done when you write your protocol that we need. So a lot of the things that are needed in an IND application are in a protocol that meets the usual standards. I know NINDS has an outline for a protocol. It's very similar to the FDA outline for a protocol. It's very similar to what the US Congress put in the regulations for an IND. So send us a protocol. It really helps. If it's sitting on your desk and you don't attach it to your IND application, I just don't understand why it wouldn't happen. But not in your shoes. Yes.
One of the questions we had is to distinguish between an investigator brochure and a protocol, since there's overlap in the content.
Actually, we expect in the investigator brochure to see a lot more detail about the studies that have been done to justify the safety. A protocol is more likely to have a summary of it and a short summary of the mechanism of the drug. The investigator brochure is going to convince the Pharm D on your faculty or the person or the clinical pharmacologist. They're going to inform them about how the drug is distributed and so on. There's going to be a lot more detail in a investigator brochure than there is in a protocol. Many investigator brochures are longer than the protocols that we see from pharmaceutical companies. But if it's an approved drug, as I said, we're willing to look at that as being an adequate representative for a small single center study. Is that, give me a nod or not, is that sufficient? So, terminology, I'm getting here close to the end. FDA approves drugs and licenses biologicals. It does not approve INDs or protocols. Protocols are allowed to proceed or they're placed on clinical hold. If they're placed on clinical hold, you cannot treat a patient according to that protocol. It's not permitted. You actually can withdraw an IND application. In other words, if you didn't anticipate a lot of problems and you have to go back and start essentially at ground zero, you may want to withdraw the application till you can come back in with a better application. Otherwise, you'll be on hold the entire time. INDs can be in effect. That's the result of sending it in and us not putting you on hold. Clinical investigations can be exempt from pre-marketing approval requirements, but exemption does not imply approval. In other words, if the application's exempt, that's a characteristic that it has. It does not have a quality that this protocol is approved by the FDA. So the results of your application or your request for exemption is that either the study's exempt, the study's allowed to proceed, it's placed on clinical hold, you decide to withdraw it, or we suggest that you come talk with us in a much more detailed discussion about problems that are identified or that you've identified, and we call it a request for a pre-IND meeting. I want to remind you that after an IND is in effect, you have a lot of responsibilities. I suggest that you read every word of any letter from the FDA. Ignore all of the regulatory difficulties and focus on what you need to do, but particularly before you sign them, read the full forms that you have to sign. And then if someone dies or gets sick, you can get in trouble here. If someone dies or gets sick because of the drug you are testing and you didn't anticipate that that would happen in the way it does happen, then be sure to report it to us immediately. You don't have to report everything that happens, but if it's serious and you didn't expect it and it's because of the drug, the laws are pretty clear. Now, this is my interpretation. I'm sure you'll have people at your institution who will be helping you make sure to do that, but it's very serious to have that happen and not report it. Please notify us when you make any changes to the protocol and add or subtract investigators, and send us yearly progress reports. Be sure to include all of the safety problems that you encounter in those progress reports, but you don't have to report every safety problem to us when it happens. Only those that I described above in general, but be sure and know from the documents what you're responsible for. I was surprised at how good this website here is. If you don't want to copy or can't copy this entire long URL, if you search for UCM 343349, this last little part back here on that, it comes up as the first selection in most search engines. And here's the address that you want to send it to. It doesn't make much difference, but it does help them get it to the right division if you mention it in the address. But send it to this address. If you send it anywhere else, it's going to delay processing your application. And this is my interesting photograph to think about, the old Coca-Cola ad that I'm sure the FDA had some complaints about. It probably does treat headaches, doesn't it? I don't know. That leaves us a few minutes.
It looks like, and I apologize if I'm not loud enough. Dr. Conwit has an excellent question of an example of an exempt study or two. I can give one of using esmolol to control hypertension in patients with subarachnoid hemorrhage, in that esmolol is approved for postoperative hypertension and supraventricular tachycardias, but we propose to use it to manage hypertension and subarachnoid hemorrhage, a new population that is not always postoperative, in doses that were similar to what was used in clinical practice there. That was an example of an exempt study. Although the second question,
I can jump to the answer, okay? When you got your exemption confirmed, if you did from FDA, call your project manager and ask them what to do. And they will probably ask you to send I'm guessing they might ask you to send a description of the situation. I don't want to talk about a specific situation, and then we can deal with it.
And that was the second question from Dr. Khan, what you were answering, a new safety concern within an exempt study that's not under the direct oversight because it's an exempt study.
Right, right. As physicians, we're all supposed to be reporting these surprises that we observe in clinical practice anyway, but of course it's really hard to remember to do that, and it takes time that a lot of us don't have.
So I'm sensitive to everyone's time. I will need to be leaving here in a minute, and also obviously I really want to thank Dr. Marler and the FDA for participating in this, and also thank the NINDS for their support of our course. If you have additional questions, if you can type fast, type them up there. Oh, here comes one. Once the study is complete and closed with the institutional IRB, does the IND still remain in effect? That's an interesting question.
Hmm. There's, I believe you can make a final report and close the IND. After a certain amount of time, I believe we will notify you that we are closing it if we haven't heard from you. Uh, but, and I believe, and this is just, I'm not exactly familiar with the closeout procedure, but I believe there's a way in your final annual report to close it out.
Also, I would like to ask people if you have a couple minutes to please fill out an evaluation of this so that we can make these sessions as useful for you in the future and perhaps suggest new topics for webinars for our 2015 season. Right now, it looks like, so sometimes, Dr. Marler, at the end, we have additional questions. One quick question I will ask while we wait for others to come in, if there are other questions, is oxygen, this would be random, and you can,
Oxygen is a drug.
and does it have a, where do you find the package insert for oxygen?
There, to my knowledge, there isn't one.
Okay. But if I send in an IND without a package insert for oxygen, you'd work with us?
Yes, but you should probably spend a little time with documenting that the dose you're using is safe in humans.
That's very good. I see a couple other thank yous coming here. You know, if there are any other questions, please email me, and we'll try to get them to Dr. Marler. I really thank you all for your attention, and also for all of the R25 participants. You've heard us say we will be posting the slides to the website along with a link to the video in PDF form. And we really thank you all for your attention. We thank the R25 participants. We'll continue to be in touch with you. And again, thank you for your support of our webinars. And Dr. Marler, thank you greatly for this great talk. And with that,
I look forward to all those straightforward, easy to review applications we're going to start getting now.
I think this will enhance good relations between the Department of Health and Human Services, and for that we can be very thankful. So thank you all. This concludes this webinar.